Hey guys, this video isn't going to be on a trail today. Actually, this is going to be a quick review on my YXZ. Our YouTube channel is starting to grow just a bit, and with a little more subscribers and a little more views, we're getting some questions, and a lot of them are pertaining to things that I've done to my YXZ, so that's pretty much what this video is going to entail. It is a 2019 Yamaha YXZ 1000R SS. And the reason I went with the YXZ is my previous side-by-side was a Honda Pioneer, and a couple things that I really liked about the Pioneer was the fact that it had a geared transmission, and along with that you had the option to go fully manual and change your gears with the paddle shift. So I really liked the idea of being in control of what gear I was in, and obviously that's what the YXZ comes with, is the paddle shift, so I was already familiar with it when I bought it. I bought this in November of 2018, and I purchased it from my local dealer, Honda Yamaha Suzuki of Knoxville. And straight from the purchase, right from the showroom, I went ahead and had them add a top, the flip-up windshield, the side soft covers, and the rear soft window cover. I went ahead and went with a front bumper and a rear bumper, and originally I went with a 3,000-pound worn winch, but I ended up replacing that, and I'll get more into that here in a minute. But as far, you got to have music when you're out on the trail, so I decided to go with AM/FM Bluetooth overhead speakers, and that's my control panel up here on the dash. That's where I control my stereo and my winch controllers and my GoPro whenever we're videoing. So I got, that's a lot of the comfort features that I wanted to add to it. But being from Oliver Springs, Tennessee, my park of choice is Windrock Park, and it is here in Oliver Springs, Tennessee. And I wanted to, if anything, I figured this would be the perfect base model to kind of transform it into the type of machine I wanted it to be able to handle the really rough double black trails here at Windrock, which are pretty brutal and whatnot. So right off the bat, along with all this, they came with 29-inch tires on the 19, which is, I think, a step in the right direction, but I kind of wanted to add a little bit more. So I wanted to gain a little bit of ground clearance, so I decided to go with Raceline beadlock wheels. And my tire of choice, I did some investigating before I purchased the tires, but I decided on the Sedona Rockabilly in a 32-inch size. And the reason I decided to go with the Sedona Rockabilly is for several reasons. One of which being they're listed as a 32-inch tire, but they're not a true 32-inch tire. They're actually only 31 inches in height, which I like that fact just due to the fact of I was afraid a full 32 would be more prone to rub. So I like the fact that they're only 31 inches tall. On top of that, they've got a really strong sidewall, and they're an 8-ply tire, which they're durable. But with all that figured into the tire, they're also, for a 32-inch tire, they're pretty light. They only weigh 37 pounds. And again, with them only weighing 37 pounds, I was kind of hoping that would save a little bit in wear and tear on the components on the machine. So since I've had these tires, if you want to get a shot of the tread, I've got 1,700 miles on my machine, and in those 1,700 miles, I'm going to say 1,500 of them are here at Windrock. And out of those 1,500 miles, I'm going to say 1,000 to 1,100 are either on the black or double black trails. So they've been abused. The tires have been abused. I mean, the machine's been abused. But as far as the tires, back to the tires, there's been several times whenever I've had a really hard obstacle to get over, and it maybe be wet or really rocky or whatever. I've aired these tires down several times to about 6 pounds of air pressure, and did whatever obstacle I needed to do. But shortly after, I would usually, because I always carry an air compressor with me, I'd air them back up. Typically, I run anywhere from 8 to 10 pounds for a full day, just depending on the weather. If it's rained a lot, I may air it down to 8. But definitely during the summer, I like to keep them at about 10 pounds of air pressure. But in the 1,700 miles I've been running these tires, I've not had a first issue out of flats or tears. I mean, they go really well in mud. They go excellent in rock, and they've not let me down yet. So as long as I'm doing this and I'm driving this machine, I'm always going to be running a 32-inch Sedona Rockabilly. Now with that being said, obviously the 19s, they came out with a lower gear setting, and it's 24% lower in first gear. So I was hoping that running the 32-inch tires, that the lower gears in the 19 would be able to pull them okay. But after a couple of times taking it out to Windrock, I pretty quickly found out that the gears were not quite low enough for the type of driving and the type of trails that I ride. The gears wasn't quite low enough for the 32-inch tires. So I took it back to Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and discussed it with them. And so we went ahead and decided to go with the 70-30 gear reduction. And all I can say is, after having the gear reduction put on this machine, it really transformed it. And that's really when I started to fall in love with this machine, in all honesty. I mean, it was able to climb so much better, going over rock, going up hills, getting in the mud. It was just an entirely different machine, and it really made a large improvement. Even with the lower gears though, there still was times when I would have engine stall. I mean, if you're operating a YXZ, whether it be a automatic clutch or a manual clutch, when you're doing slow technical trails, engine stall is just gonna happen. It's just part of it. But one thing I did do, I think at about 400 or 500 miles, to try to help alleviate that, I did go with a Super ATV heavy flywheel. And again, after adding the flywheel to this machine, that really, again, it was just another improvement. It gave me a lot more low-end oomph. I'm now able to carry on a low-speed momentum much easier without engine stall. And the gear reduction and the heavy flywheel, they really mesh really well together. And again, it's just improved my machine to do the type of trails I'm riding. So I've got a little bit better ground clearance now. Now that I've got my gears straightened out, I was able to focus on a few other issues I was having with the machine. And one of those was being, even with the 32-inch tires, and this is going to be with the majority of side-by-sides at Windrock, there's going to be times when you bottom out and you drag on a rock or things like that. But what I was noticing with mine is I was really bottoming and dragging a lot in the rear of the machine. And just by looking at the side of my machine on a level surface, you could tell that the rear end was quite a bit lower than the front. So a pretty easy solution for that, if you want to come around here to the back, what I did with that is I just jacked up the rear end, and I just tightened down my rear springs just enough to level out the machine somewhat. And so now, after tightening the rear springs down some, I raised it up. And now, according to Yamaha, they recommend that the lower end, or the rear of your machine, be lower than the front. And you know, that's what they recommend. But again, this machine isn't on a racetrack. I'm not making 60-foot jumps. You know, I'm driving over rock, mud, and ruts and things like that. So the better the ground clearance for me, just better ground clearance, the better off you're going to be. So, and again, after tightening my rear springs, as far as changing the ride quality, I really couldn't tell that much of a difference. It still rides pretty plush, pretty comfortable. It doesn't really beat me too awful bad to death. And also too, coming from a Honda Pioneer with the suspension that the YXZ has, personally, I feel like I'm riding in a Cadillac. So after raising the rear end of my machine, that was again another added plus. So now I'm back to the point to where if my front end clears an obstacle, pretty much my rear end's going to clear it as well. I've got 14.5 inches of ground clearance in the front and about 14.25 inches of ground clearance in the rear. So I did listen to Yamaha's recommendation, so I did keep my rear end about 1/4 inch lower than the front. So then the next issue, after all my ground clearance and gearing and all that's pretty much lined out the way I want it to be, the next problem I was having was with my steering. Now, with the steering, when you're in 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive limited slip, this machine steers just perfect. I mean, I have no problems at all with the steering, but whenever you lock this machine into front diff, it becomes really tough to steer. Really tight, really hard, especially whenever you're doing slow trails. So I couldn't find a lot of solutions for that. I searched, couldn't find much. But one day I happened to be looking at some YouTube videos, and I happened to run across a UTV on demand video, and it was about a West Coast race car build on the YXZ with all the parts furnished from Texera out of Tracy, California. So I was interested in it. I started watching, and one of the things that they mentioned was their A-arms. And they're high clearance A-arms. They make front and rear lower A-arms for high clearance. But what really, when I first heard of high clearance, obviously then better ground clearance underneath. I'm interested in that. But then as the video went on, they started explaining that not only do they give you better ground clearance on the A-arms, but they also improve your steering. And the reason they improve your steering, for several reasons, but mainly they're built out of 1.25 inch tubing made out of 4130 chromoly. The sheet metal is 4130 chromoly for gussets, and they changed the caster on the front A-arms. They changed the angles and the geometry, which allows for a little bit of lighter steering on your front A-arms. And after having these put on, I could definitely tell a significant difference in my steering. Easier to turn. You're still not going to, you know, steer when you're locked in front diff. You're not going to be able to steer it with your pinky by any means. It is still a little tight to steer, but as far as compared to what it was with the stock A-arms, it is night and day difference. Now, if I see an obstacle coming up that I've got to go into front diff, I don't dread it. I mean, I lock it into full differential, and steering is a lot easier. I'm able to make much sharper turns, and it was just, again, and as far as ground clearance, they add 2 inches of ground clearance. They don't actually raise your machine, but they give you 2 inches of ground clearance in the A-arm area as compared to stock. So whenever you're in the ruts, the high clearance A-arms is a tremendous help. And we'll go back and get a quick little shot of the rears. Yeah, they're made out of 4130 chromoly, so that makes them a little lighter than stock, but they're just as durable, if not more durable. Now, also too, I added these Yamaha flares straight from the factory. I did not go with the 911 just yet, and I'll get into that here in just a second. But I started off with these, and for about 400 or 500 miles, and they kind of did an okay job keeping mud out of the cab. But as far as keeping the windshield clean, they wasn't very effective, and that's why I ended up going with the 911s. And then I said I'd get back to my winch. I originally started out with a 3,000 pound Warn winch, but it wasn't quite. There was one time when I was at a really bad spot at a really steep hill and had to make it over some rock and some rut, and the 3,000 pound Warn just didn't have enough pulling power to get me pulled up over it. So I ended up changing my winch from a 3,000 pound Warn to a Warn 4500 with synthetic rope. It's actually the exact same winch that comes on the 2020 XT models, but instead of the steel cable, I've got the synthetic. Now with all that, some of the questions that I've gotten asked as far as modifications and changes that I've made, I get questions like, well, how is running the type of trails you ride affect your clutch? Well, so far, 1,700 miles, I'm still running my stock clutch. And as far as I can tell, it's going strong. I don't know if that's a testament to my driving or a testament to the lower gears, but I kind of like to think it's a mesh of both. But yeah, still running. I have not had to do anything with my clutch, stock clutch. And then I get other questions like, do the 32-inch tires rub? Well, the reason I brought up the flares, when I first bought this machine and I was just running the Yamaha flares, there was no rubbing whatsoever. And again, I'm not really doing the jumps and the 65 mile an hour curves and things like that. But with just running these, I had no rubbing issues on turns or at any time whatsoever. But after adding the 911 flares, there was times, and there still is, whenever I do rub a little bit on the bottom. But I mean, if you guys watch our videos, a lot of our videos, I'm running my GoPro, and you can tell just by watching the videos, there's not too awful much rubbing. To be honest, that's not nearly enough to make me consider changing tires or removing my 911 flares. I mean, that's just a couple things you got to become accustomed to make the modifications that I've made to do the type of trails that I do. I'm also running Rhino axles, Super ATV Rhino axles, front and rear, and I'm running Weller tie rods. Now, the reason I decided to go with the Rhino axles primarily is because within the first 100 miles of having this machine, I broke a front left axle, and my front right axle was bent, and that was the stock axles. So I'm sure due to the trails I'm on and the oversized tires was putting a lot of strain on the stock axles. So I did decide to go with Super ATV Rhino axles, and since I did that, and I had those put on in January of 2019. So I've been running the Rhinos now for a year, and all through that time I have broken 3 Rhino axles, but I feel really good with the Rhinos. I think they've held up to their end of the bargain. I mean, 1,700 miles, and a lot of those miles have been pretty rough and hard trails. To only break 3 axles, the Rhino axle is definitely going to be the axle for me. I've had no issues out of my tie rod. A little incident a while back, but it was, I think, due to me and a friend of mine installing them. We kind of made an installation error. But other than that, the Weller tie rods are excellent. I have no complaints out of those. They held up really well. At 1,300 miles, I did have to replace my steering rack. It wore out on me. And whenever the steering rack got replaced, I went ahead and went with another stock, but I did add a Weller steering rack bracket. So I'm hoping that will help make this one last a little bit longer. But whenever this steering rack ends up going, I'm just gonna hopefully nip that issue in the bud and just go back to Weller and just get their steering rack and hopefully be done with the steering rack issues. At 1,500 miles, I blew my front differential. It finally went kaplooey, and but again, whenever you're using diff, a lot of the times that you ride and you're steering pretty hard over the rock and the ruts, I mean, things are going to break. Axles are going to break. I mean, whenever you ride Windrock or other places similar to Windrock, and you do it 2 to 3 months or 2 to 3 weekends out of the month, things are going to break. I mean, it doesn't really matter what size tires you're running. It doesn't, you know, I mean, it's just going to happen. I mean, there's not really much to avoid it. So the way I'm trying to do with the heavy duty axles and the tie rods and things like that, I'm just trying to avoid any type of breakage that I possibly can. I feel pretty confident that my front diff was probably going to go no matter what type of axles I was running. My steering rack was probably going to eventually go no matter what type of tie rods I was running. So just some of the things that I've done to try to keep my machine going. And as far as repairs, I usually change my own axles. I change my own fluids and things like that. But whenever it comes to the more precise, time-consuming jobs like replacing a steering rack or a front diff, I just let the service department of Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki of Knoxville handle that, because I mean, they're really quick. They do an excellent job. I take it to them. They fix it right the first time. Saves me from having to troubleshoot and spend a lot of time working on things that, for one, I'm not even probably going to be completely aware of what I'm doing. But I mean, the parts department of Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, the 2 guys in their parts department, they're on top of pretty much everything. If there's anything about this machine that's needed, they're going to know what it is. They're going to know where to get it. And the service department, parts department, both. I mean, they're pretty much hands down second to none in the Knoxville area. So yeah, they are definitely my go-to guys whenever major repairs are needed on this machine. So after adding the wheels and tires, getting the gears straightened out with the reduction in the heavy flywheel and the better winch and raising my rear end with the ground clearance, I've pretty much got this machine dialed in to where it goes really well. And having it dialed in and giving it more capabilities has kind of made me want to push it further and further and do a little bit more crazy things. And so in doing these things, I started thinking about my safety, which made me want to start doing some research on a crash cage. So as far as the crash cage goes, I wanted something that was light, but not only light, but I wanted it to be able to be strong and sturdy enough to handle a rollover situation. And I also wanted a cage that would allow me to keep all of my Yamaha accessories. So with that being said, as far as the review on my cage, I'm actually gonna go meet up with John and Travis at APOC Industries, and I'm gonna let the professionals do the review on the cage. And so I guess with that, let's just jump on over to Louisville, Tennessee at APOC Industries. That was a quick jump to Louisville, Tennessee here at APOC Industries. I'm here with Travis Vance. He's the gentleman that made the cage for the YXZ. And Travis, not only are you a mechanic and a fabricator, but you're also an off-road enthusiast as well?
Yes, sir, that is correct. I've been in the off-road world for about 20 years now. Kind of know the ins and outs of everything. Been building cages for about 12 years now. And so far, everything is held up to my expectations on everything that I've built. And of course, there's always curves to learning in this industry, no matter what you do.
Right, but you actually go out and do the off-roading, and you've done a lot of off-roading with cages that you've made for yourself.
Oh yes, sir, definitely. I've definitely tested and tuned a lot of cages I've built in the years I've been at it.
And you've done a lot of buggy competitions as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, I've competed for SRS and a few other smaller competitions locally, and had a great time doing it.
Well, see, I already know all this because I know Travis. He's a pretty good friend of mine. And I've ridden with Travis many times, and I can honestly say that every ride I've ever taken with him, it's been a complete adventure. Okay, now that was actually you in the video rolling in the buggy, right?
Yes, sir.
And was that a cage that you had built?
Yes, that was one of my personal buggies I built and raced for about 2 years.
Now, that's just another reason why I put my trust into Travis to build my cage. I know many people that ride Windrock that has also put their trust in Travis, and it really gives me a full sense of safety and securement knowing that my cage was built by Travis and here at APOC Industries. So with that being said, I guess let's just jump into it, and we'll let Travis tell us exactly what he did to it.
All right, so let's start off. You know, Keith brought us his YXZ here, and he wanted something more durable. He had been out riding a few times, seen some people with some minor rollovers and cages not holding up, and he wanted something more stronger than a stock cage, which he had done purchased all his accessories and everything for his stock cage. So, you know, we guaranteed him we could make everything fit back pretty close to factory. So other than just being the factory cage look, we added in the windshield bars and stuff like that for extra support. Factory cage is 065 wall, and we done a mix of 095 wall and 120 wall DOM for his cage. We added extra supports in the ceiling on the inside, which is 120 wall. And then as of today that we know of, everything still fits and works properly with the aftermarket cage for all the stock requirements.
Everything fits perfect. Okay guys, that pretty much sums up all the modifications I've done to my rig and the crash cage. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it in the comment section. And if you haven't hit subscribe, and definitely stay tuned for future videos. And thanks for watching.